Fiction Mystery Quilt.
Hi, I'm Linda Smith.
And I'm Sue Ellen Jennings.
Hi y'all, I'm Linda Smith from Flash Fiction Mystery Quilt. Today I'm going to be teaching you step by step how to make a flanged binding like this one. It looks like piping on your quilt, but it's not. It's so fun and so easy to do. Let's learn how now. So I did my quilt math. Measure the length and the width of the quilt that you are binding. Take those two numbers and multiply each one of those by 2. Now add the total you got for each of those numbers together, and that number is how many inches it's going to take to go around the entire diameter of your quilt. But wait! You're going to need extra to join the ends together when you get done binding your quilt. So let's add 20 inches to your total. Now, take that total and divide it by the width of your fabric. Most fabric is 42 inches, some is 45, but you're going to divide that number, whatever you came up with, by the width of your fabric. That is going to give you the number of strips that you're going to need to have. Now in this video, my quilt requires 7 strips, so you're going to hear me talking about cut 7 strips. Your quilt may be entirely different. And I know that I need 7 strips of my flange, or the piece that's going to be the actual little piping area, and I'm going to be using my orange fabric for that. My main binding fabric is my deep navy. So for the flange, I'm going to cut the strips at 1 3/4 inches. For the actual binding, that will be at 1 1/2 inches. So I'm first going to even off the edge of my fabric here and get a nice straight edge, and then I'm going to start cutting my 1 3/4 inch pieces. Now I have all 7 of my strips cut for my flange, and it's time to cut my actual binding fabric, and that is going to be cut at 1 1/2 inches. If you do not have a giant cutting mat, you just have a small one, let me show you how you can fold your fabric so that you can work on a smaller mat. So these again are going to be 1 1/2 inches. Fold this in half and line it up on my salvage edge like so. And I just want to make sure that I have that it's nice and straight and even all the way across from one end to the other. And then I'm going to line up on one of the lines and make sure that this is very straight. And I am going to trim off my edge and get a nice clean edge before I start cutting. Always start with a nice clean edge on your cutting. We're going to cut 1 1/2 inch strips. We're going to need 7 of these, just like you needed 7 of your flange fabric. Now that I have all of my strips cut, I am going to press out the seams that are in the center of each of the strips. When you're doing binding fabric, you don't need to trim off your selvage edges because they get trimmed off after you have sewn them together. If you've never made binding before, the process is really simple, and I know that you can join end to end like this, but that doesn't make as pretty and as flat of a seam as it does to do it on the bias, and I'm going to show you how to do it on the bias. You simply take one strip of your fabric and then you lay a second strip on top of it, making a little cross. Now, because we left our selvage edges on here, we want to make sure that there's an overlap on each side. And then all we're going to do is sew from the left to the right corner like this. I usually will drop my needle down so that I know that I'm in the exact corner. If you don't come out in the center, it will mess up your pieces when you go to open them up, and I will show you that once I open these up. But I chain piece mine. So the top piece, the one that I added, and again these are right sides together, I'm going to find the end of it, and it's going to be my new bottom piece. So I have it, and I'm simply going to lay it down, and I'm going to get a brand new strip from my pile, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to put them right sides together, overlapping a little bit like so, and then I'm going to spin it so that I can go corner to corner. And just make sure that you don't get these all wobbly like that or like this. You want them shaped sort of like a T or a cross. And then I'm going to aim at the diagonal straight down to come out on this corner. So we just need to cut these apart now where I chain pieced. Alright, and so your seams end up, and this is what happens when you don't get them straight. Wow. Okay, let's find one that's straight. I'll have to seam rip that and fix that. But that's what you get when you have your lines straight. So if you have one that looked like that one, which was hideous, by the way, so you can see how far off it is, just simply seam rip it and re-sew it so that you get them nice and straight so that they look like this. Not this. That's bad. I always have one, at least one, when I do chain piecing. And if you look, you can see why this is so bad. See how it didn't start up here in the corner, right there? Instead, it started down here, and that makes for a very ugly seam. But we shall fix that in no time. And I am dropping my needle to get the exact corner this time. And then I'm going to sew it again. And we'll check it to see if I got it right. And I do. I'm going to run my whole piece and check every single one of them, and after I check them and make sure that I don't have any more that are not pretty, then we will simply trim off these dog ears. Alright, so these are all fantastic, and now we are just going to go ahead and trim them to get them ready for when we go over to the ironing board to press them. You're going to trim and leave a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I just follow this line right here to cut off the little dog ear. And the same here, following this edge to cut off the dog ear. And I'm going to repeat the same process all the way down. All right, so we have all of this trimmed and we're just going to set it to the side. And now I'm going to sew these together. Now I know they're smaller, but it's going to be the exact same thing. We're going to lay one right side up, and then we're going to put another one shaped like a cross on top, and sew corner to corner like so. Time to trim my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and then trim off my dog ears. Alright, I've brought all my strips that are joined together now over to the ironing board, and I'm just simply going to press these seams open. And I'm going to do this for both strips, and then we will come back and I'll show you what you need to do next to get this beautiful flanged binding. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take these two pieces, our 1 3/4 inch piece and our 1 1/2 inch piece, and we're going to line them up right sides together and line the edges up, and we're going to the sewing machine and we are going to sew these together with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And now I'm just simply going to sew all of these strips together. Making sure that we're lined up properly. Be super careful as you're sewing these together not to pull on them or stretch them. When I prepped my fabric to make this binding, I sprayed it all with Mary Ellen's Best Press to help stiffen the fabric a little bit and give it some body. I am a really big believer in pressing your fabric well, and so I always start by setting my seam, and so I'm just going to run through every bit of this and set this seam. Now that I have my seams set, we are going to press towards the dark side. So I have my dark fabric on the top, and I am simply going to roll over the edge and press this seam over all the way down the strip. And you want to press this nice and flat. Once you have your entire piece of binding pressed, then we are going to fold it in half like so, lining up the edges, and we are going to press it so that the wrong sides are together. And I am just going to keep moving here, lining up my edges and pressing. And you can see what we end up with is our beautiful little tiny flange. It looks almost like piping. I am using my wool pressing mat for this, and I have my iron set on low steam. Normally I do not steam my binding, but because I want this to be a really nice crisp edge where the flange shows right here, I am using a little bit of steam on this to help get that pressed beautifully into place. Here's a quick tip. Now that you have your binding all made, or for any binding, if you're like me, you make your binding and then the next day you sew it on your quilt. Well, take an old ruler or just a ruler that you're not currently using and just roll your binding around the ruler like so, and that will keep it from getting wrinkled and keep it safe for when you are ready to add it to your quilt. And again, just be careful that you're not stretching it as you're adding it. Once you get all of your binding rolled on your ruler, simply pop a pin in it to hold it in place. And it's ready to use. So I have my quilt laid out here, and this is the back side of my quilt. So doing this type of binding, you're going to want to take your binding, you're going to lay it on your quilt, and you're going to have your flange or your accent fabric facing up. Then you're going to sew it on with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. As you can see, and I'm going to show you what it will look like when it's folded over, it's going to come over and look just like this. And because you added your 20 inches extra so that you have little overlapping flaps, you will start sewing somewhere right around here. That gives you plenty to join these two ends when you get it on. So I'm going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to get this sewn on. Let's get this binding put on the quilt. Again, I'm going to use my flange side up with the raw edge matching the raw edge of my quilt. I have my walking foot on, but if you don't have one, no problem. And I have it set to right around a 1/4 of an inch and my little guide thing on as well. I'm going to get about 10 inches worth of fabric, and I'm just going to leave that flapping, and I'm going to put the rest under my foot. So that'll be my starting point, and line up with the edge like so. I also like to start on the left hand side of my quilt. I don't know, I just like to join my bindings there. And if you like to sew your label into your quilt, you need to have it ready, because I sew it into the binding on 2 sides. Now remember, you are sewing this onto the back side of your quilt. The front side is where this will flip over and your flanged edge will show. Be sure to support your quilt so it is not hanging down and dragging. And I just let the binding, the whole spool that I made of binding, stay in my lap. Another neat little tip is to wear your quilting gloves. It helps you to get a good grip as you're helping to support your sewing machine and guiding all this heavy weight between your foot and the quilt. I'm just going to sew all the way around this. When I get to a corner, I will show you how to do corners. I'm coming to a corner now, which is right here, and I have my label pinned in place, one to help hold it in place while I'm sewing my binding on, and another so that I don't forget to put it on. I've done that before. At any rate, so I'm just going to continue to sew down to this corner, and I'm going to get a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And then I am simply going to take my machine and raise the foot, my needle is down, and I'm going to turn and I'm going to sew right off my corner like that. You can see I'm coming straight down, and then I sew diagonally right off the corner. Once I've done that, then I'm just going to fold this over like so and make sure that it's straight across right here, and then fold it back onto itself like so. And I'm going to turn the entire quilt, and I'm just going to start sewing my 1/4 inch seam again. Now I do have, like I said, this is folded over, and that will give me my perfect mitered corner. So I'm just going to hold it in place as I spin my fabric around to get it under the machine. Be sure that you're lined up on this side after you do your little fold, and put it back under the machine and start sewing again. So I've made it all around the quilt now, and I've come to where I left this little tab of binding, the about 10 inches or so, and here's my other end. What you're going to do is you're going to take your remaining piece of binding. So here's my little tab, and here's my long piece that I had left over, and so now I'm just going to trim this up to where it's just a little bit shorter. I've got it trimmed a little bit too long. There. Now I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to lay it on top. I'm going to lay my piece that I am attaching to from the bottom down on top, not stretching it, and then I'm going to put this piece of binding that I just trimmed off and line it up with the edge, and that tells me how much I need to cut off of this remaining piece so that these will join together properly. And so I'm just going to trim right along here. One of my great tips is to clip your fabric together so that it is not pulling when you are trying to join these together. So I just put a little clip here. You can pin it as well. Just sort of keeps the excess quilt out of the way. You take the top piece, the one that you just finished sewing down, lay it down on your machine and open it up like so. And then you take your bottom piece, open it up, and lay it down on top the same way we did the binding. Now this one you're going to get a little bit closer to the edge on. As you can see, I am right about here on this. I've got about 1/4 inch. I'm going to try to scoot over a little bit closer and be closer to the top and the bottom. So it's, I'd say, about just a little bit bigger than 1/8 inch. Sew it exactly like I sewed all my binding strips together, sewing left to right corner. Take your time with this part. It's kind of fiddly because you don't have a lot of working room in here. That piece does not want to lay down flat right there. And you shall mess with it. There, we got it. I'm going to drop my needle so that I'm sure I'm in the corner, and then sew straight from this corner down to this corner. And if I did this right, once I open it up and flip it over and take my little clip out, this should be down flat in here. And as you can see, it does. Now I've got to trim these edges off just like we did when we were doing the binding. I'm going to trim it at 1/4 inch. Always check before you trim, because if it's too tight you can just seam rip and resew it. You want to be able to seam rip. So Check it before you trim your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then trim off your little tabs, dog ears. This one I am going to lightly finger press this open. And then all I have to do from here is continue sewing my binding on just like I was sewing it on before. Make sure that if you're finger pressing yours open, that it doesn't come flopping all over the place and make a bump. And continue sewing down to where I originally started. And now my binding is completely attached and ready to bring over to the front side of the quilt, and it's going to look like that. Because this quilt that I'm binding right now is our 2024 Flash Fiction Mystery Quilt, I can't show you the top, but I'm going to use these little quilt clips, and I'm simply going to roll this over and fold it under like so and clip it in place, and I'm going to do this all the way around. It just makes it easier. Well, we made it to where we're going to be sewing our binding on the front side of the quilt now. You have a couple of choices. One, you can stitch in this stitch. Before you do, make sure you feel over and feel where the other side ends, because what you don't want to do is stitch in the ditch and hit this back side of your binding. You want to be on the quilt, not up on the binding. Mine is very close to being on this binding, so I am going to be stitching on the edge of my orange fabric. As I go and I pull my clips off, I'm just going to take my fingers and roll it over and make sure that it is over really good right where I want it. Alright, I've got my quilt up in my lap, that way it won't pull too much. I have my stitch length set at 3.0. I like a bigger stitch or a longer stitch when I am doing a top stitch like this. And for this, you just sort of need to take your time because you just want to stay right on that edge. And I did get some thread that I thought was a pretty close match. Just a quick little zoom shot of what I'm doing and where I'm sewing. So as you can see, my needle is coming down just right on the very edge of the flange, and I will have to sew slow all the way around. When I get to a corner, I'll come back to y'all and show you how we're going to do our corners. Alright, let's learn how to sew a corner. So I'm sewing down this way, which tells me that I want this to be underneath this one when I fold it over. But the first thing I'm going to do is nip off the end. You can see my stitch line where I applied my binding right here. And so I'm just going to take the corner off, not getting down into this stitch line. This will help this lay down better. There we go. Ooh, that was close. See how close I came to the stitch line? Well, at least I didn't hit it. So we got that cut off. And now I'm going to lay this down nice and flat. And there's going to be a little bump right here. That's normal, but you're going to have to deal with it. So I'm going to take my fingers and I'm going to roll this fabric over, pressing it so that it stays over really nice. And then I'm going to put a clip in it to hold it because it is going down first. So I need it to stay in place for me. Then I'm going to take my fingernail and run it along here to get a really good crease in this. And then I'm going to take my top fabric and fold it over just like that. Now I'm going to sew down to it, and I am going to pivot with my needle down once I get to that corner of the orange. And let's do that and show you what that looks like. So I still haven't let go of it with my finger. I'm going to zoom, well, dad blast it. Okay, there we go, nice and clear picture. And if you can see, I haven't crossed the edge yet. I'm sitting right, my needle's right there, and I'm sitting right here. I am going to take a stitch, maybe two, to where I get that completely crossed and tacked down, and then I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to lift my presser foot and pivot. Drop my presser foot back down and continue sewing just like I did before. I'll lift this up a little bit. There we go. And that's how we sew a corner. I don't know if I can get to it to show it to you. I cannot. Once I get a little bit further down, I'll pull it out and show it to you. And here's my corner that I just sewed. Perfect mitered on that side and perfectly mitered on this side. Fantastic. I hope y'all enjoyed this video on making flanged binding. Please like and subscribe. We have plenty of things planned for the future. And if you've never looked at our website, flashfictionmysteryquilt.com, take a look. We have a brand new mystery quilt starting on August 31st, 2024, and it is called The Stone. It is a beautiful, I'm sewing it, whimsical quilt pattern, and it is just gorgeous and going to be so much fun to sew. It's going to be a great year. Bye, y'all.